We're partway through chapter 18 of Matthew. So we had the king, and we had servant number 1 and servant number 2. And I drew 2 circles this morning. One circle like this, and the other circle like this. It's a great circle. And this morning we focused strictly on the first circle to begin with. Somebody was just explaining to me the value of the currency in those days. This amount that was owed here, this $52 million approximately, that was owed as a debt, would have taken, in terms of the monthly salary in those days, 150,000 years to repay. 150,000 years to repay a debt of that magnitude, according to the salary of those days. And we concluded with the thought this morning that Jesus greatly exaggerated this amount when he told the story, because he didn't want any of his listeners to fail to grasp the fact that the debt which sin has placed us under is a debt that we could never repay, because we have fallen short from the perfect obedience, the perfect righteousness which God builds into every created being that he creates. And when you think about it, the kingdom of heaven could never be built on any other principle but perfect obedience, could it? Even the slightest deviation from that principle would result in catastrophe. As we have already seen, the deviation that took place in heaven has resulted in the misery and suffering of the inhabitants of this world that could spread throughout the entire universe if the kingdom of heaven was to be built on any other principle but perfect obedience. Not, however, a forced obedience, a love response, never a forced obedience. And the one thing we concluded this morning, I'm summarizing what we did this morning, the one thing we concluded this morning then, that the human race can never offer to God is what? Perfect obedience. Because once you are imperfect, you are never in a position to offer perfect obedience, because you're beginning with an imperfect beginning. In fact, the Bible says we are conceived in what? Yes, indeed. We are conceived in iniquity. Every aspect of our being has been touched by sin. That's why this week we're focusing on a God who has done so much for us. And he's done it out of love. No other motivation. He's done it out of love. Because that is the kind of God that we have. Are you letting him love you? Are you? Well, try not to look so happy about it if you are. Are you really letting him love you? I'm very excited this morning because somebody who came to me yesterday and has had great difficulty in relating to God as a God of love was touched by the Holy Spirit during the night, and this morning has awakened with a heart that is responding to the love of God. It's the most beautiful development, and I mean somebody who was not capable of responding to God's love, because this individual had not really tasted unconditional love ever in their whole life, but this morning came to me and said, I'm responding to the love of God. And I could tell by one look at the face of this individual that it was true. One look. And the Lord has impressed this individual during the night as well to go forward in baptism. Beautiful development that has taken place. That's what the love of God's all about. So I said this morning, even if you don't feel it, believe it. You don't have to feel it to believe it, but once you start believing it, you will ultimately feel it. You all know, don't you, that actions come before feelings. You know that, don't you? I hope that's permeated New England, that actions always precede feelings. Great principle. It's a biblical principle to understand. That means if you don't feel good about another person, what should you do? Act right toward them on principle, and you will ultimately feel good about them. There are many people who wait until they've got the right feeling before they can act. That is absolutely fatal. When it comes to spiritual realities, you act on faith, even if you don't have the feeling. And before long, the feeling will be generated. I hope you've proved it. It's especially important when it comes to relating to God. You may not feel the love of God, but you can believe that Jesus has died in your place, and that you are not condemned. How does a person look, by the way, when they're not condemned? Do they run around like a dog with his tail between his legs? Is that the look of a person who's not condemned? Somebody approached me this morning after breakfast and said, my struggle is I don't seem to have joy in the Christian life. Well, don't miss our 1:30 meeting, will you? Because we're going to be describing there the steps in having joy in the Christian life. And it's rooted, I mean, you're going to be telling them to me, aren't you? Because you all sat up till 2 o'clock in the morning studying this. Those questions that I gave you yesterday in the meeting. I hope you've got them ready. I'm expecting them at 1:30 this afternoon. But the secret of having joy in the Christian life is understanding and appreciating what God has done for you. And if that is in place, you will then be privileged to see God do in you the most incredible things. This afternoon we're going to talk about the secret of joy, and tomorrow in that afternoon meeting we're going to deal with how a born-again believer overcomes habits of sin in their life. A very practical step for every one of us. Coming back now to the reality of our parable. Remember this morning, this poor slave, when he fell down in verse 27 before his master, he still had not seen the generosity of the king, had he? What foolish request did he make of the king there this morning? Give me enough time and I'll pay back the whole debt. If he'd been thinking intelligently, he would have known he's thinking of 150,000 years to repay that debt. It's absolutely an outrageous request that he made of the king. And as I said this morning, let's be thankful that even when we're being outrageous, God doesn't take us seriously. He offers to us the beautiful privilege of having the debt absolutely wiped out. I am not spending my future worrying about my past. Are you? Another one of those famous New England responses there. I meet so many people who tell me that they're appreciating what Jesus has done for them, and they spend their entire lives worrying about what they've done in the past. What is that an evidence of? Unbelief, you're right. It's unbelief in what? That the king has absolutely wiped out the past. And we get whole schools of psychology, don't we, that are based upon digging up the past. And until you can work through every experience of the past, it is claimed you will never have peace of mind in your life. Well, I've got news for you this morning. The New Testament makes it abundantly clear that the sins of the past have been placed upon the scapegoat. That was a bad expression, not the scapegoat, but the lamb, the sacrifice. In a sense, he was our scapegoat because he bore our sin upon himself. Don't forget it, will you? Don't spend your present or your future punishing yourself. I challenged a few of you on that this morning. Those of you who want me to dangle you over the flames of hell and singe you a little so you can feel better, because you'll never be satisfied until you beat yourself and punish yourself for the mistakes of the past. What a tragedy. The past has been erased. Do you believe it? If you're declared righteous, there's not a blot on your past. But God hasn't left a vacuum there. He has replaced your past with what? With the perfect life of Jesus. That was the debt that was paid. He offered his perfect life in place of your sin-scarred life. When it first hit me one day that in looking at me, God doesn't see me, he sees Jesus. He sees Bill Liversidge with the record of Jesus. What a privilege that is, isn't it? What a privilege. My entire debt has been wiped out. I don't have to spend the rest of my life guilty and punishing myself because of the mistakes of the past. What I have to learn to do now is to live and walk as though I believe that. That's the biggest challenge, isn't it? If you're a son or a daughter, then how should you act? Like the servant of the household? Not at all. You should be living and walking and talking like the son or the daughter of that king. Let's move into the parable a little further now. What an incredible story this is, isn't it? What an incredible story. Verse 28. That slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him how much? 100 pence. What does your margin say? What's it the equivalent of? How much here? $44. Do most of you agree with that in your margins? $44. I want you to think about it. This debt was $52 million, and he had just been pardoned from his debt. And he comes across another slave. Isn't that significant? He comes across a fellow slave. Here we had a king and a servant, but here we have a servant together with another servant, and the debt is $44 compared to $52 million. And how does he treat his fellow servant? Say that again. Grabs him by the throat. Can you believe this? Grabbed him by the throat, my version says, began to choke him, saying, "Pay me what you owe me." It's dramatic, isn't it? He's just come out of an audience with the king and been forgiven the most incredible debt, an unpayable debt. What a relief it should have been to him. And comes across somebody that owes him a pittance in comparison, grabs him by the throat and starts to choke him and shouts at him, "Pay me what you owe me." You have 2 minutes to tell me, 2 minutes to tell me why he was so anxious to have that debt repaid to him. You have 2 minutes to tell me, and that means, of course, you will now communicate with one another. Reach out to those independent individuals who are still sitting alone and pull them in to you so you can communicate with them. Why was he so anxious to get this debt repaid back to him? So anxious that he started to choke his fellow servant. How many hands are up? Let me see. It's getting better. Getting better. We've got this power block over here again, all working together. I like to see a group working together like that. Very encouraging. Very encouraging. All right, let's get a response from over here to begin with. Okay.
We felt that maybe he was self-righteous. He had come to the point where he was all forgiven. Now he was upping. It's like, well, now I'm better than you.
All right, they think that he's self-righteous and that he's become a little uppity now. I'm sort of better than you now that I've been pardoned. It's not a bad insight. It's getting us, it's hovering around first base, isn't it? Hovering around first base. Let's move on a little, okay? Speak up, please.
We came to the conclusion that he didn't truly accept the king's offer, that he did forgive him.
Ah.
Therefore, he went out and said,
Ah.
I paid this debt back. Well, here's $44.
Ah. Is it possible, they're suggesting, that he never really accepted the fact that the king was actually forgiving him of all his debt? Is it possible that he's missed that, and because of his anxiety over his debt, what is he going to do? In order to pay it himself, he'll have to start calling in all his own debts. Yes, indeed, it's very possible that his anxiety drove him to do something like that. Yes. Ah, that's good, yes. He may have accepted it, but like so many, failed to appreciate what was really being extended to him. And oh dear, how many do that with the grace of God? We've been talking about it all the week, haven't we? To believe that you've been pardoned, that your guilt has been removed, and then to run ahead punishing yourself because I've been such a terrible sinner. I know people who do that over and over again. I had a woman up in West Virginia the other day, came to me after a meeting like this, and she said, I feel as though I don't deserve the grace of God. I said, well, praise the Lord for that. She said, because I missed my devotional reading one morning this week. Well, I said, I'm sure that God has made a very careful note of that and is going to remind you of this one of these days, and it may in fact just swing the balances against you, and you will miss out on the kingdom. And all of a sudden she looked at me and she said, you're not serious, are you? I said, what do you think? I have been known to crack a joke before. Yes.
I think that,
Speak up, please.
I think that we should understand that also there are a lot of people who don't want to be that indebted.
There are a lot of people who don't want to be that indebted.
They want to do something
It's embarrassing.
to help them get
All right. They want to do something on their own. We are truly a stubborn race, aren't we? Because God is offering us the most incredible thing, and yet we continue to fail to appreciate it because of our determination to put ourselves in there somewhere. It'll alleviate my pride a little if I could just help to pay for this somehow myself. So I said to you all at the beginning of the week, when it comes to matters of salvation, self-esteem is not a healthy development. You need to see yourself exactly as you are. Then when you see the worth that God has placed in you, that's when you recognize your self-worth, and you can now spend your life productively. But a healthy self-worth is not rooted in high self-esteem. It is rooted in the knowledge that I am of all men most miserable. I am chief of sinners, said Paul. But that doesn't mean I'm in a hopeless condition, does it? Because I'm appreciating what the King has done for me. This man obviously was failing to appreciate what the King had done for him, so incredibly, he's going to spend his time calling in all his own debts so that he can try and whittle away this incredible debt that has already been erased. How fickle the human race is. In other words, what was he failing to appreciate most of all at that moment? When he called in his own debtor, what was he failing to appreciate? What do you want to tell us about the character of the one? Yes, indeed. In fact, doesn't the Bible tell us that there? In verse 27, the Lord of that slave felt what? Compassion. His heart was touched. How can you fail to see the love and the compassion when God saw that we were incapable of paying this debt, and that sin had condemned us all, not to the kind of life that he had planned for us, but a life of suffering and struggle and ultimately death? I want you to know that God's heart was moved. He had compassion. And he said to his son, let's find a way. We don't want to lose these children. Let's find a way. That's the kind of God we have, you know. We need to see that softness of God, don't we? That love, that mercy.
But the plan of salvation was made before.
Yes, it was. But imagine when sin actually came. Can't you see the members of the Godhead coming together, you know, saying, you know what we talked about? The time has come. And I think not even Jesus fully comprehended the pain of allowing himself to be treated as we deserve to be treated. To be treated as a forsaken sinner, suffering the full effects of sin and ultimately death. To have his own Father turn aside. That bond of unity between the members of the Trinity had never been broken. Never. And at that moment of separation, Jesus in agony cried out, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And how few people really comprehend that in forsaking Jesus, God was revealing the tremendous love that he had for the human race. Jesus did not pay a cheap price, did he? He knows exactly what sin is doing to you and to me. He has felt the agony of separation from the Father. He's felt the darkness, the hopelessness. He understands that. That's why he's in a unique position to tell you what happened to me is credited to you. I did it for you in your place. That which you could never have done. That's his love. He's holding it up to you. Are you appreciating it? Are you accepting it? If you are, what's it going to do to you? What are we looking at here in this first circle, by the way? Who has pulled that together for me? In theological terms, what are we looking at here? We're looking here, of course, at imputed righteousness. Of course we are. The debt was paid without any contribution from the debtor. All you need, by the way, to be a recipient of that grace is to acknowledge your need and to throw yourself on the mercy of God. And you have all that is embraced there in wiping out the debt. You have the perfect life of Jesus, treated as though it was you. What a privilege. And what happens to the life of anybody who sees and responds to the love of God like that? Let's read on here and see if this is a typical example. So he grabbed the throat of his fellow servant and shook him and cried out to him, "Pay me what you owe me." And incredibly, the man that owed him this sum uses some very familiar words, doesn't he? What have you noticed there? Exactly what this man said to the king. The fellow servant now says to him, "Have patience with me. Give me a little time, and I'll pay you off." Was that a reasonable request? A denarius was the equivalent of what? 1 day's wages. How many denarius are we looking at here? 100. So we're basically looking at 3 months' wages. Would have been a sacrifice. It's true. Would have hurt. Maybe if he'd been allowed to spread it out over 12 months, he could have handled it. I've known people that have done that. In other words, we're not even now looking at a debt that is incapable of being repaid. It could realistically be paid back over a reasonable period of time. And how does our friend, who, by the way, has just come from the presence of the King, having been pardoned of an outrageous debt, how does he respond to the plea of his fellow man? Look at it very carefully there. Verse 30. He was unwilling, however, but went and threw him in prison until... Isn't that a ridiculous statement? He threw him in prison until he could pay the debt. And if he was a servant, the only way he could pay that debt would be to keep on working. What is this man doing at that moment? You have 1 minute to talk it over. 2 things that the man who'd been forgiven his debt is doing at the moment that the king would never do. 2 things that he's doing. Talk it over together. Who sees it with great clarity? Yes, here. Listen very carefully now.
I had a lot of help. First of all, he's asking him to repay a debt that is impossible for him to pay. He's asking the impossible because if he's in prison, he can't earn it, so he won't pay it. Like we cannot possibly pay the debt that we owe for our sinfulness. And second of all, then he's in prison with this debt that he can't pay, and he can't earn anything to pay it, so he's condemned for life or for eternity. He's condemned to stay in prison, he'll die in prison because there's no way to do it.
Did you all hear that? When you hear this kind of development taking place in the life of the one who has been pardoned, what's it saying to you? Pardon? He's telling? Yes, but what is it saying to you? There should be a very profound thought coming through at the moment. Yes. He feels condemned himself. He feels condemned himself.
He has not become like the person that forgave him.
So he hasn't become like the person who forgave him. That's a very interesting comment. Yes?
He doesn't realize the magnitude of his debt, and therefore he can't appreciate what he has received, and therefore extend it to others.
He doesn't realize the magnitude of his debt. So his appreciation is minimal. And therefore he has nothing to extend to others. Excellent thought.
He allowed the king to do for him, that is, in forgiving the debt, but he did not allow the king to do anything in him. Therefore, he did not forgive the debt.
All right. He allowed the king to do for him, but we've already decided that perhaps he didn't fully believe that the king had done that for him.
I think a very important factor here that we experience in our own relationship today is not only a lack of appreciation, but a lack of understanding.
Yes, yes.
The individual did not understand the situation. He says, look, I can pay the debt.
Yes, indeed.
Which was impossible. So I think this is so important for us to realize if we are going to have the right relationship, we have to have the right theology, we have to understand what it's saying to us.
So self-understanding is a very big factor, isn't it?
Another thing you mentioned, self-worth. Now, if somebody is going to cancel a debt for me for $52 million, it says I'm really worth something.
Yes.
In that relationship. So I think our self-worth really is important when we think in terms of what has been paid for us.
Yes.
Real self-worth.
All right. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Yes.
People usually treat another person the way they believe God is treating them.
People usually treat another person the way they believe that God has treated them. That's a very good insight today. Excellent insight. I agree with that. I find that over and over again. So a failure to treat another individual with love and forgiveness can be traced to a failure to perceive how God is really treating you. I like that very much. Yes. Freely you have received, freely give. But if you're not giving, then you can be confident of one thing. You haven't received, or you're not perceiving what God has done for you. Yes.
Servant number one could have thought that the king was foolish and forgiving him, but that's not a natural.
He could have thought that the king was foolish. It's an interesting observation. Fancy forgiving me for a debt like that. He's crazy. I mean, seriously, nobody in their right mind would do that. Yes, I think you may be right.
Servant number one set himself up to be in the same as the king was in his situation. In other words, he stuck servant number two in prison. Therefore, he made it a debt that he could never pay, which is the same situation he was in.
Very interesting. Servant number one is trying to set himself up as the king. And he called in his debtor. There's nothing wrong in calling in your debtor, is there? And asking for the debt to be repaid. That's quite legal and acceptable. But when the individual came in before him, he created a situation that made it absolutely impossible for the debt to be repaid. And that's the difference between this man and the king, because the king knew about the impossibility of the situation, and his heart was moved in love and compassion. Yes? Speak up, please.
Could you send it in a way the gentleman had removed the servant number two to freedom of choice?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. He robbed this man of the privilege of choosing to do what was right. Yes, indeed. And remember, the relationship between these two individuals was not a matter of life and death, as it was here.
King thought servant number one.
Speak up, please.
The king thought servant number one was worth $52 million, but servant number one thought that servant number two wasn't even worth $44.
The king thought servant number one was worth 52 million, but this man never thought that this one was worth even $44. Yes, indeed. He placed very little worth. He didn't see a value in his fellow man. I am absolutely appalled, by the way, how many professed Christians see apparently such little value in other human beings. I find that absolutely appalling. And I've decided it's only because they haven't seen the incredible value that God has placed upon themselves. Yes, indeed. It's a beautiful thought that's come through here this morning. A beautiful thought.
I think although he has been given his debt, he feels that he
Yes, indeed.
working toward it by asking him for another service.
There are many like that. We've already mentioned that. Who, they hear what God has done for them, but they cannot believe it. Who are incapable of comprehending that. I worked with one individual when I was in Las Vegas pastoring. A lady came to me that had so much bitterness and so much horribleness in her life. She'd been badly treated as a child, raised in an extremely legalistic Adventist home. She was locked in a closet on Sabbaths if she ever disobeyed, and she would sometimes spend the entire Sabbath day locked in a dark closet as a little girl, crying out in terror. And her father would stand outside the door and say, "Now you know how God feels about little girls who disobey him." And she walked into my office and she shrieked at me, "I hate him." I said, "Who?" She said, "God. I hate him." Well, I said to her, "What's he done to you?" And she described her childhood. I said, "Well, I think I'd hate him too." However, I want to point out one thing to you. Is it possible that the God that you are hating is not the God of the Bible? You may be hating the distorted picture of God that your father has misrepresented to you. This girl had so much bitterness in her heart. And the Lord said to me one day, "Hang in with her. Don't give up on her. She's not capable of seeing my love at this moment. She's never been treated with unconditional love." Imagine if you'd been raised like that. There may be some of you, I've met at least one on this campground, that's never known unconditional love and told me yesterday could never trust anybody. That's why this little victory this morning has been such a beautiful thing. And so I hung in with this lady. She's in her 30s. She had 2 children. Her husband was a Mormon, but he'd left her. He decided to come and steal her 2 children back one Sabbath morning while we were having Sabbath school. This was quite a story. So she decided to take all of her bitterness toward God out on me. And she started phoning my home. Her record was 200 times in one day. Telephoned my home. My wife was going bananas. And there'd be nobody there when you would pick up the phone. It didn't matter if you changed your number, she found out the new number. So I decided to weather it out. Took 2.5 years. And the bitterness got worse and worse and worse. One night she phoned me up at 2 o'clock in the morning and she said, "You'll never guess where I am." I said, "Where are you?" She said, "I'm sitting in your office down at the church." Well, I said, "That's nice for you. How did you get in there?" She said, "I hid in the church and was locked in." And she said, "Can you hear any unusual noises over the telephone?" So I listened and I said, "Yes, there's something going on there." She said, "I'm tearing up all your books and all your papers." She said, "I'm shredding all your plants, pulling every leaf." "Oh," she said, "it's just delightful to do this. Aren't you coming down to have a look?" I said, "No, have fun." And I hung up the phone and went back to sleep. The next morning I went down to the office. What a mess. Books and papers and letters everywhere. So I got on the telephone and I called this girl. It's one of the great learning experiences of my life. That if you happen to be in a relationship of any kind with somebody who is not capable of responding to the love of God, the only possible way to reach them is through unconditional love, but not by being an enabler of their bad behavior. There is a fine line, I've discovered, between ceasing to be an enabler. And those of you that have been through Alcoholics Anonymous, you'll understand that term. Some people enable others to continue on with their bad behaviors. In fact, if you're in a relationship where you're getting abused, I'm sure you know that it's because of a weakness within you, don't you? You are probably an enabler in that situation. And the Lord said to me, don't be an enabler, but treat her with unconditional love. That's the way God treats me, by the way. He never approves of behavior that is offensive to him. Have you noticed that? He even permits me to suffer and to reap what I've sown. But he never withdraws his love from me, even though at times I'm going through the agony of learning from my repeated mistakes that some behavior is offensive to God. I'm praising him today that he never withdrew his love for me, from me, even though I went through several years where I knew that my behavior was offensive to him. He allowed me to suffer. He kept hitting my head against that wall to show me this is not my way, but he never stopped loving me in the process. So I called this gal. She was very surprised to hear me on the phone. She says, well, what do you want? I said, I want you here in my office within 30 minutes. She said, no way. I said, you're going to be here. She said, why would I ever come back to your office? I said, because I believe that you don't want to be the kind of person who does things like this. I believe in a lady, I won't use her name, but I believe in a lady who wants to be loving and who wants to be loved. I don't believe this is the real you doing this. This is sin in you. It's not the real you. She'd just come, by the way, from 3 years in a psychiatric institution. She almost lost her mind over being abused in the name of the Lord. Never tasted unconditional love. I said, I want you here in 30 minutes, and she came. And she stood there in front of me shaking and crying. I said, listen, I believe that you don't want to be this way. I believe in you. I'm going to leave the room now. I'm going to give you an hour or two, and I want you to clean it up. I'm not an enabler. I want you to clean it up. I want you to put all my books back, paste all the letters back together again, go out at your own expense and buy me new flowers for this office, and when I come back, I want to see it exactly as it was before. She said, you're a hard man. I said, no, I care about you. I believe in you. And by the grace of God, you're going to do this. And she did it. She put that office back together again perfectly. I had the privilege, by the way, before I left Las Vegas, of baptizing that woman. I wish you could have heard her testimony. My wife, as I said, almost went bananas. It just sent me into peels. But I hung in with that woman and had the privilege of having her stand up one day in the church and testify that for the first time in my life, I understand what it means to be accepted unconditionally. And she shared with everybody the horrible, I've only told you the tip of the iceberg, the horrible persecution and things that she did to my family. But the Lord kept saying to me, hang in there. She's never known love. And when that bitterness was worked out, a beautiful love took its place. She took my wife and I out for dinner the night before we left that city to move to Texas. And she shared with us that night how the rest of her life will never be the same again, because finally somebody treated her the way that God had treated them. That was one of the biggest points of growth in my entire life. I learned some valuable lessons from it. And please don't miss what this parable's telling you, will you? That only those who truly appreciate what God has done for them in Christ are given what? Have imparted to them grace. Grace, not only to become like the King, but to treat others as he has treated you. And I keep hearing people saying, and I believe it, we need a revival of love and caring among us. But it's not something that you can artificially hype yourselves up to. You know that, don't you? It only comes when the heart is absolutely touched with the love of God. Then it flows through you, and you will treat others exactly as God has treated you. What a beautiful development that is. Don't allow your anxiety to have a character like him to rob you of seeing what makes that character possible in the life of one of his children. Let's bow our heads together as we conclude today. Father, what a God you are. You have wiped out from us a debt that even if we lived for 150,000 years, we could never have atoned for ourselves. Because you have supplied the perfect substitute, one who was so righteous that not even by a thought did sin take possession of him. And yet he allowed himself to be treated as we deserved, to be set apart as a forsaken sinner, to be condemned to die the second death, the death of separation from God, because he knew that to those of us who trust and believe in him, that magnificent offering would be credited to us. It's almost as though we died because his life was offered in our behalf. And Father, this morning we want to respond to that love. We want to open wide the door of our hearts. And we want you to know, Father, that that love which you have had for us can flow through us into the hearts and lives of others, that they will surely know that we have been with you. We praise you for this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.